Now, if you want to talk about the Sermon on the Mount, right? The Sermon on the Mount is from what we know is the longest recorded sermon by Jesus. You know, he sat on the mountaintop, like on the mountain. He had all those people they coming to him to listen to him. In the Sermon on the Mount, we know that Jesus corrects false teachings, teachings that were being perpetuated by the other religious leaders of his day, the Pharisees, the scribes, the Sadducees, all of them, right? So Jesus was correcting all these false teachings, and these false teachings by these religious leaders were indeed misunderstandings of what God has said, God's word. And because of the false interpretation of that word, what was happening at the time of Jesus Christ was that the Pharisees and Sadducees were demanding strict, rigid, inflexible observance, and also I'll say elitism, which completely, totally missed God's word, or what God intended for his word to mean. And so when Jesus Christ sat there on the mount with those listening to him and his disciples, he began by describing the traits he was looking for in his followers, right? And he called those who lived out those traits blessed, what we call beatitudes, right? Those who adhere to his teaching, he called them blessed, because God has something special in store for them because of their obedience to God's word. So each beatitude is what? Each beatitude is an almost indirect contradiction of society's typical way of life at that time, and it's the same thing in our society today. It's almost contradicts what society tells us to do sometimes in our own churches. Well, so now Jesus' teachings Sermon on the Mount places a very high level of emphasis on purity, righteousness. And when I say purity, I'm talking about purity of the heart, right? And at the same time, it draws listeners, all Christians, all believers, to what? The basic standard of righteousness. That's what it was. So consequently, what we see Jesus including many warnings in the Sermon on the Mount, warnings that were meant to keep his followers focused on God, God's love, God's grace, God's righteousness, of course, and God's mercy. All right. So that's what it was. That's this just a brief summary, or a summary of what the Sermon on the Mount was. Now, this is what I want to do. The Sermon on the Mount covers about 3 chapters: Matthew 5, 6, and 7. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to give us a quick outline or breakdown of the Sermon on the Mount. So it is about righteousness. What is righteousness? And then Jesus is saying, I'm going to show you guys what true righteousness is. All right. So that's what we do. So what true righteousness is, he calls the Beatitudes. And so we see that from Matthew chapter 5, verses 1 to 12. Not only that, right? But he also talks about how righteousness or holiness is reflected. And so we see that in Matthew 5, verses 13 to 16. Okay. And then, of course, he talks about how righteousness comes in terms of enforcement, law enforcement, right? Enforcement. And we see that in verses 17 to 20. So if you have a Bibles, please turn with me to Matthew chapter 5. And I'm just, like I said, I'm running through, doing a little bit of an outline. Okay, Matthew chapter 5. So he talks about this, and then of course he also talks about how righteousness ought to work in our lives, in our daily life, and we see that from chapter 5, verses 21 to 21 to 40. So what you see right here on the slide gives us a breakdown of the Matthew chapter 5, what Jesus was passing on to his listeners, his congregation, his audience, those who were there. Now, when you look at Matthew chapter 5, 21 to 48, there's also a subdivision, what I call subdivisions, right? So we see, for example, when he was talking to the disciple, his listeners, he's from Matthew 5, 21 to 48, we see sub breakdowns. So, for example, Jesus Christ talks about murder and anger and murder in what? Verses 21 to 26. And that is in reference to what? That is linked to Exodus 20, verse 13, because he was going back to what Moses had taught what we call the Ten Commandments. Okay. And then the next breakdown from verses 21 to 48 is what? It's about adultery. Adultery. So we see that verses 27 to 30, he talks about adultery. And that, of course, that also refers to Exodus 20, verse 14. 20 verse 14. And you see, when we talk about adultery here, what happens is that many Christians or believers misinterpret this, and as well as many parts of the Sermon on the Mount. And so what happens is that it leads to guilt and frustration and condemnation. Why? Because that's what the Pharisees had put in place. And so today, if we're not careful, we are also going to toe the line and be like the Pharisees in terms of our understanding or our interpretation of what Jesus Christ was saying. And then we end up feeling all guilty, frustrated, and of course feeling condemned. So that's why we see that there. And then he talks also about divorce, verses 31 to 32. Jesus Christ talks about divorce. And then the next thing he talks about is swearing. Swearing, verses 33 to 37. He talks about swearing, and then he talks also about retaliation. Retaliation, those of us who can't forgive and always want to hit back, retaliate for something done to us. Jesus Christ talked about that in verses 38 to 42. All right. And then finally, he talks about what? The love of enemies. So he goes from, look, you don't need to retaliate. Matter of fact, what you need to do is what? Is to love your enemies. So he talked about that in verses 43 to 48. And all these that Jesus Christ talked about from verses 21 going is all are related to the Ten Commandments that Moses, the law. So we see that, like I said before, the Sermon on the Mount extends from Matthew 5, verse 2, all the way to Matthew 7, verse 27. And we see also it is recorded in Luke chapter 6, but it's a little different. But it's essentially the same message. Please write this down. Take your notes and take your notes, because it's very important. Matthew 5, 27 to 30 is a part of the Sermon on the Mount. And the crux of the moral message is that the basis of all sin is what? Is the inner thought. The basis of all sin is the inner thought, not just the outward act. That's the crux of the message, because Jesus Christ is talking about what? Purity of the individual, purity of the heart. And so Jesus Christ is saying, like we saw last week in James 1, 14 and 15, it starts with what? The inside. It starts with the inside. All right. But we are going to break this down a little bit as we move forward. So that's what Christ was teaching. That's where it starts. A person commits the sin when he or she wants to do it. You want to understand what I'm saying? The individual commits the sin when he or she wants to do it. Because when you look at what Jesus Christ told his hearers in Matthew 5, 28, he says what? He says, but I say to you that whoever looks at a woman to lust, you see, to lust for. So right away we see what Christ is saying. We see what Christ is saying. You look at this at something with the intention of doing it. That's what that's what Christ is saying. And so what Christ was doing right there was Christ was rejecting all the Pharisaic and the Sadducees and the scribes, the teaching that they were propagating to the people. In the Sermon on the Mount, Jesus did two things. Jesus did two things. He rejected the traditions of the Pharisees, and then that's from verses 21 to 48. And then you know what he did? He rejected their practices. So now, we'll be seeing some distinctions here as to what Christ was doing. Matter of fact, he was challenging the proud and legalistic religious leaders of his time, and then he turned them back to the Old Testament, to Moses, to the prophets, the same prophets who, just like Jesus Christ, taught that heartfelt obedience is more important than legalistic observance. Again, Jesus Christ is telling them that what? Heartfelt obedience is what? Is better than legalistic observance, which was what the religious leaders of the time were teaching the people. Now, I want you to note something here. Six times, listen carefully now, six times in this passage, Jesus said, "You have heard that it was said." You have what? Heard that it was said. And then he says, "But I tell you." So now he was bringing the new teaching that was totally different from the traditions of the religious leaders. And so what we see here, you have heard that it was said, but I tell you. So right here, you can see the references. You can see the references to those times that he said, "You have heard, you have heard, you have heard." So you can see that in that Sermon on the Mount, Jesus was laying down the law. He was laying down the foundation of truth, laying down the foundation of what the law means, or how to interpret the law. So these words make it clear that Jesus was presenting what the Pharisees and teachers of the law were saying to the people, which was what? Which was in contrast to what he was teaching them. And so one first thing he was presenting, what the Pharisees and teachers of the law were saying to the people. You have heard, you have heard, you have heard. And then he was juxtaposing that to what God's true intent of the law was. So that's what he was doing. And so he was spelling out, for example, in verse 20, Matthew 5:20, he was spelling out his statement that righteousness of the religious leaders was not enough to gain entrance into the coming kingdom. Let me say that again. He was telling them that your righteousness, the righteousness that you're imposing on the people, is not enough. It's not enough to gain you entrance into heaven. So what does Matthew 5:20 says? Matthew 5:20 says, "For I say unto you." See, for I say unto you. Now we see authority. We see somebody who's in charge, command, that except your righteousness shall exceed the righteousness of the scribes and Pharisees, ye shall in no case enter into what? Into the kingdom of heaven. So right away, what he was doing was he was demolishing anything that the scribes and the Pharisees and the Sadducees, all of them were teaching.